Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start us off. My name is Lwando, and I represent the Constitution Hill Trust. Thumbs up if you can all hear me. Okay. Welcome to the We the People Roundtable. It's a partnership between Constitution Hill and the Nelson Mandela Foundation. You know, in my mind, both Nelson Mandela and the Constitution have been consequential, not only for South Africa, but globally. Both garner enormous interest, both have been unfairly expected to fix all things, and both are widely misunderstood and taken out of context. So for the 25th anniversary of the Constitution, we have partnered with the Nelson Mandela Foundation to bring you the We the People Roundtable, a series of conversations meant to deeply interrogate our constitutional democracy, but also to personalize our Constitution. Our first roundtable was on the politics of the rule of law, which is always timely in a society that struggles with accountability. Tonight's roundtable is about queer equality. Again, a very important theme as it focuses on our Constitution as an emancipatory instrument. Apartheid was a system that marginalized identities that deviated from the norm. It was a system of binaries, blacks and whites, male and female, straight and gay. Today, our Constitution has allowed for previously marginalized identities and new identities to emerge, adding to the language lexicon of gender and sexual orientation. To borrow a phrase from the chairman of the NMF, the task of our constitutional democracy, I think, at 25 years is to normalize freedom. How do we move away from simply gaining freedom to being able to fully experience the range of what freedom means? How do we dismantle continuing forms of unfreedom, violence, poverty, racism, and homophobia? How do we create a society, in the words of our trustee, Justice Albie Sachs, that affirms that difference should not be a basis of exclusion and stigma? And how do we celebrate the vitality of difference? For more on the We the People Roundtable, please follow We the People South Africa on Facebook. Please visit our constitution.constitutionhill.org.za to learn more. And with that, I hand over to my colleague from the NMF, Neo.
Good evening, friends. My name is Nao Mogopa, and I work at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Welcome to the second We the People Roundtable discussion, critically commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Constitution. The Nelson Mandela Foundation is a non-profit organization working in the memory dialogue nexus. We are custodians of Nelson Mandela's life and times and work to mobilize his legacy by providing memory and dialogue resources towards the creation of an equal society premised on human rights and dignity for all. We're very excited to have partnered with the Constitution Hill Trust on this project. In Feeling Strange, Cameron Awkward Rich has this to say, quote, "Let me put it this way. Blackness and transness, as they are imagined in this place and time, pull one in opposite directions. Anyone that has lived as Black in this world knows that Blackness is imagined to have something to do with pastness, with being stuck, either in the sense of somehow being developmentally lagging or politically stuck in the past, harping on old problems when the thing to do is move on. To be trans, however, is to be regarded as a perpetually new invention, having arrived from the future, making demands on a world that isn't ready to acknowledge that one exists. Both of these constructions are absurd, to be sure, but both have effects on how one can and does live a life, how one feels about doing so." Close quote. To put it perhaps in more academic words, Calvin Warren in Afro-Pessimism, Queer Theory and Ethics puts it like this: "The term Black queer is a philosophical conundrum or problem space. It brings two crises into juxtaposition, creating somewhat of a theoretical fatality, a devastating crime scene. At the site of this fatality lies a mutilated, supine Black body we cannot quite place within the symbolics of identity, politics, history, sociology, or law. In cases like these, we put theory and philosophy into service to figure out who did it, What was the murder weapon? What was the injury, if we can even call it an injury? This situation frustrates the researcher in that they lack a coherent grammar to make this suffering legible. The assaulting party is more like a structural phenomenon, and the fatality is a precondition of the war itself. And in this sense, the fatality is rendered banal, diurnal, and quotidian, as it sustains the very field of existence. Close quote. In my country, there are grammars contesting the space over my life. The Constitution has its grammars, the church has its grammars, the state has its grammars, the academy and the taxi rank have theirs too. Somewhere between queer, between LGBTQIA+, between oppressed and previously disadvantaged, between Mofi and Staban, between they, them, theirs, between Judith Butler and Oyeronke, between the past and the future, between cascading constructions of blackness and constructions of transness, between grammars of violence and history, grammars of bureaucracy, of control, of life and love, between grammars of non-ontology and grammars of futurity. I am meant to make a life happen. What does the Constitution have to do with it? Is this book willing, even capable, of thrusting Black queers into existence? I hope today's discussion will be fruitful and compelling. We could not have dreamt of a better panel, even though Professor DeFoss once refused to supervise my master's. But otherwise, please follow us on Twitter at Nelson Mandela to join the conversation using the hashtag #WeThePeople, and visit us at nelsonmandela.org to subscribe to our newsletter, which is also where you can donate to the foundation and support the unfinished work of Nelson Mandela. And with that, I thank you, and I hand over to our host, Songezo Mabete.
Thank you, Luando. Much appreciated. Thanks to you as well, Neo. I can't help but notice the fact that you spoke of the wonderful panel. I am not a panel member, and you make no comment about the host. Perhaps you could have thought of a better host. That's why you decided to be silent on that matter. It remains to be seen who the host is going to be for the third roundtable, because I will remember that. Thank you indeed, everybody, for joining us the world over. Welcome to South Africa. It's rather chilly where I am. I'm in a jersey. Everybody else, particularly the Cape people, seem to be in open collared shirts. Queer equality is the conversation this evening. Queer equality. Has the Constitution fulfilled its promise of dignity for all? And we're going to have a conversation in the broader sense and context of minorities, minority communities, minority voices, those on the margins of society, and how continuously we have an obligation, constitutional obligation even, to make them, as everybody else is and should be, in the mainstream, so that we don't have a conversation of majority and minority. There shall just be people. Don't you just remember those eminent words from Bantu Biko, where he said, I wish to live in a society where there is no majority, where there is no minority, there are just people. Speaking about those times, perhaps we should reflect back. Somebody who has seen much of those times from which we come as a society, who has been very instrumental, among many others, in the redefinition of this current society, and even legally, in the context of this constitution, has heard and argued many cases, and written as many judgments that seek to centralize people, make people the center of the engagement and transactions of our constitution. He's there, he's in a tie, he looks like a real lawyer, unlike the others here who style themselves as lawyers, who don't present themselves as such. Judge Edwin Cameron, that's the last time I'm referring to you as judge, at least for the conversation's duration, because for the sake of parity on everybody else, we are on a first name basis, much like the style of the first roundtable. Good evening, Edwin, welcome. Your thoughts, please.
So, first of all, I refuse to let you drive a wedge between me and my beloved fellow lawyers, Professor Pierre DeFoss, and my beloved former colleague, LB Sachs. Secondly, thank you very, very much for agreeing to chair this. Thirdly, it is a complete joy to be on this panel with the other panelists. I'm going to out you and the organizer of this event, the main organizer from the Constitution Hill side, Luanda Klaso, as former law clerks at the Constitutional Court. So no fewer than 4 of us on this panel have employment and residential and locational associations with the court. Songezo, I want to start off by saying that Monday, the 17th of May, was the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia. And of course, this is an annual global commemoration. I was shocked, in fact, to check this week and to discover that the day was chosen because it was the day in 1990 that the World Health Organization declassified us, me and Neo and the other self-identifying queers on this panel, and fortunately the queer allies on this panel are not so classified. We were no longer classified as having a mental disorder. That astounded me. But I also want to say very briefly, Songezo, that our promise of equality in the Constitution came from 3 historical sources. I'm going to give a very quick overview. The first is Simon Kordi, who was arrested in September 1984 for the massive uprising against apartheid in the Vaal townships. He was imprisoned. I met him when he was an awaiting trial prisoner in Pretoria, and he did the astounding thing, not only of coming out to his fellow treason trialists. He was accused number 13 on trial for treason and murder, but he actually, when they rejected him as a homosexual man, he challenged them and he forced them to accept him. That extraordinary act of sustained activist courage laid the basis for the next 2 events. The next was what I like to call, with their permission, and I hope it remains permissive, the Dykes of Cape Town, Sheila Lipinski and others, who had been, the moment it became possible to negotiate in South Africa in 1990, the Cape Town queers and dykes insisted on including sexual orientation in the Constitution. And the third fact is the receptivity within the ANC. LB, please give a wave. LB Sachs, Arthur Chasselson, George Bezos, and the other members of the ANC's Equality Committee. Those 3 things you can see were pivotal. And when I say that these were the pivotal things to our Constitution, I don't exclude the men in suits, the white men in suits, myself and Kevin Botha, who made submissions to the constitutional process at Kempton Park. But those were the 3 foundational historical moments. And I'm very glad, Neo, that you mentioned blackness and queerness, because Simon's stand and the stands of other Black queers in Africa, like Frank Mugisha in Uganda, are absolutely pivotal to all of our liberation. And I say these domestic events were historically momentous, not to be parochial, not to be a sort of constitutional nationalist, but because to minimize Simon's presence and participation in the constitutional process is, as some do, I fear, is to disrespect and dishonor his memory and his presence in the constitutional process. All of this, of course, as Luanda has mentioned, is celebrated on Constitution Hill. It is celebrated on the website that I hope will be on your screen shortly, ourconstitution.constitutionhill.org.za. And I'm asking everyone listening, and we have hundreds of people registered, as well as hundreds more watching the live stream, to contribute to the timeline, contribute to your stories, because our queerness is important in South Africa for some of the reasons Neo has already given, that we are different because we are in a society of accumulated extreme differences. And our queerness, that was the argument we made to the Kempton Park Constitution process. Our queerness, if it is not protected and recognized, then no other conditions can be protected. And our queerness is a challenge to the Constitution drafters, which was recognized and enshrined. So many thanks, Songezo, for allowing me to make those opening comments. I dearly and deeply look forward yours and to my fellow panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice. Thank you so much, Edwin. Much appreciated. You got me thinking there, and you reminded me of a few things that you and I would have spoken about, both of our time at the court in 2014 when I was clerking, and recently in the conversation you and I had yesterday, specifically how I almost felt somewhat misplaced in this dialogue by virtue of my orientation and the fact that in the larger context, I belong to the majority of this conversation, of this topic. And how even the nuances there are within that come from my socialization. I come from a relatively, if not exclusively, very binary society. You're a male or you're a female. There are just no two ways about that. Just outside Queenstown, rural, Eastern Cape, Whittlesea, former Ciskei. My education, East London, a boys' school, a proud boys' school, Selborne College. You're a boy and you were being geared and reared to become a man. That was it. That was the conversation. There was no mainstream because the mainstream assumed there was a minority. There wasn't that. It was just that conscientization that I was a man. And if I didn't look like a man, I didn't sound like a man, I didn't do anything like a man, I was talking about labels to which Newa referred to earlier on, a pufta, a morphia, and all of those attachments, which for somebody who wasn't like me, would have felt completely misplaced. I was watching a video yesterday as I come through to you, Jabu, my brother at the same Selborne College, in a reunion address. The school's proud moment is a school's Founders Day, as many of you might relate. He spoke about the fact that one of the challenges he had as a former head boy was convincing a contemporary of ours to come back to a 10-year reunion, to which that contemporary point blank refused to come. Why? He said, I know the reception I will get if my sexual orientation is ever known among ourselves. I will not come for reasons that we both know, given that we come from the same environment. And I just want to engage that, engage these thoughts, engage me and many people who identify as me, Jabu. Specifically when Newa says, the construction of our society is that anybody who is trans is treated and seen as somebody who's coming from the future, from a different world to this space where this world doesn't recognize him or her, hasn't made allowance for him or her, doesn't know how to deal with this individual. Talk to us, please, then, how we should better engage that aspect of the broader conversation of queerness.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. I think it's really an important moment to kind of really think about our 25 years in marking the Constitution. And it's interesting just to locate our very construction of when we celebrate history or when we mark the history, because in marking that history, we also need to mourn that history, because that very history presents many people and renders many people invisible in that time. And one of the communities that were rendered invisible in the struggles for the inclusion of sexual orientation are transgender people, who were very much part of the forefront of that. I also remember as a 23-year-old being elected onto the coalition advocating for the inclusion of sexual orientation. You know, in those moments, having identified as lesbian, having identified with the struggle as a feminist, still do identify as a feminist. But within those journeys, I think it would have been very hard to find language to speak to the identities relating to trans masculine identities. I think there was a great deal of narratives or language that pertained to trans women at the time, also deeply pathologizing language or closely associated to trans women being associated as drag queens, or, you know, all different language other than being recognized for who they are, being women and being men, and being trans women and being trans men. And when we think about queer history, and who shakes the various systems of society, it's not the normative looking person. It is the one that is putting their bodies in the front line of disidentifying with normativity. And when we disidentify with normativity, we then become the gaze of public violence. And in that disidentification, we are also reclaiming who we are as trans identities. So I think there's a massive amount of, I think, almost a reconciliatory process and a healing process within the LGBTI community now to look back at the people who were equally harmed and excluded from within the movement because they were never conforming to a normativity that the Constitution would have wanted. You know, the couples, the normative couples, the couples that would emulate heterosexual families. And if we were all just emulating heterosexual families, society would accept us. And we know that that stereotypical arguments has never won any gains for anybody. And in fact, now we are really sitting at the nexus of looking at what it means to be in our bodies when we are being killed and murdered at the rate at which we are, despite constitutional frameworks and legal frameworks. And we celebrate those legal frameworks because they're strong and they're needed and they're pillars, but they are absolutely meaningful in the when we just continue to litigate and shame the state that is currently intellectually has a deficit intellectually as well as financially. So we're really sitting in this moment of what does it mean when we look at history? Should we look at what's missing in that history? Because should we stop believing that we had a victory? Because I think we need to stop believing that we had a complete victory. I think just the overcoming of apartheid itself was an immense victory. But I want to speak about gender identity, and having grown up and born in 1971, you're born in a colored body where you cannot go to so many places, no beaches, spaces, designated for white people. And in my transition, you equally deal with an unacceptability in law that your body is not acceptable, that your body legally continues to remain violated by the state, by various systems. And we're really sitting in that moment where we have a celebratory framework that is an empty shell in gains. And we have fought everything that we could in relation to establishing the values of normative families. And I think that's a great victory to be had. But I do think it's a moment for us to really assess whether we have stopped the fight, since all gay people can now adopt and get married. And so trans people are on their own and intersex people are on their own, because we must remember when 1990, when homosexuality was removed as a mental disorder in the International Classification of Diseases, the United Nations kindly added transgender and intersex as mental disorders. So transgender health was classified as a gender identity disorder, and intersex people were classified to have a development of sex disorder. These classifications still exist. We still have people that are gatekeeping our identities, and self-determination is just a mere imagination of what we want. So I think we are sitting in that, and we are not all free, until everybody's free in that alphabet soup. And really, that's where we're sitting.
That's where we are sitting indeed. I'm going to actually engage some of those thoughts. A lot of them are thought-provoking. And just for the record, I forgot perhaps to say initially that we don't have too much time left with Justice Edwin Cameron, because he has to leave for a prior engagement in about 15 minutes from now. I'm not at all trying to curtail your contributions, Zetu. Let's have a sociological discussion about what it is that we are speaking. Oh, I see Zetu has just disappeared. Doesn't matter, she's going nowhere slowly.
She was
Yes.
just saying she's got a storm where she is and the network's acting up, but she's reconnecting.
What a perfect metaphor, because this is a stormy issue that we are discussing here. And it is important that we actually have this discussion. Thanks for the confirmation, Jabu. Pierre, let me come to you in the interest of time. If you like, there's law, just as Edwin Cameron gave us the basis of Section 9. There's reality. And Jabu's lived experiences are more probative, in my view, than what law says. Law almost speaks of a utopia, what is desirous of the society. But that is subservient or less than a person's lived reality, a person's experience, a person's transaction with this law. Tell us about the experiences then of the law, rather of living in the body that the law doesn't quite fully recognize, or the people under that law do not fully recognize.
Yes, so you know, I think that for me, a very interesting thing is having lived through the transition and the adoption of the Constitution, and like Edwin, when I was at university or growing up as a teenager, that idea of actually telling somebody that you're attracted to another man was preposterous. It's like saying I'm a mass murderer. It wasn't conceivable. So when the Constitution was adopted, and it was a kind of affirmation that for me already, I'm white privileged, but I think for most people who were queer or queer, it was a magnificent moment. And it was also that time when we were all shouting the Rainbow Nation kind of slogans. So much so that I remember about a year after the Constitution was adopted, I was in Cape Town outside a gay club, having an intense smooching match with another guy called Bongani. And then the police came. It was still those yellow police vans from the apartheid era, and a white Afrikaans policeman got out of the car and he said, "What is the trouble here?" And this is now in the spirit of 1994 and Section 9.3. I turned to him, maybe also the spirit of other things. I turned to him and said, "Well, we are kissing. This is New South Africa. The Constitution protects us. Go away and catch the criminals." Which I could do, maybe because I'm Afrikaans, I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm in the middle of Cape Town. And for quite several years, I thought that is actually really the reality. And then, of course, one realizes that rights are complicated because the rights are not enjoyed by everyone in exactly the same way. And individual, the protection of one part of your life does not necessarily mean without other parts of your life being protected, makes you less capable of enjoying the benefits that I have now described. So if you, your race, your gender, whether you gender conforming or not, whether you're staying in a rural or urban area, whether you live in a conservative community, all of those things contribute to what extent you can actually taste the fruits of this product of freedom. And so that for me is a kind of lesson that one cannot really divorce all of these things, whether it's the right to education, whether it's a right to dignity and freedom of expression, and the right to housing and healthcare, all of those things. Without them, the part of you that is also gay or trans or lesbian or queer, whatever you want to call it, is not going to be able to flourish in on an equal footing. So I think it's very important for all of us, if we engage in any kind of struggle, to try and remember that and not do as the coalition did in 1994 and erase trans people from the story. Having said that, one more thing, I think though that over the years I've come to realize that the law is to some extent has a productive kind of effect. So it is part of culture, and it helps to produce culture. And slowly that part helps us to do the other things that are not about going to the court and winning a right or writing a law. The important but the most difficult part, namely to change people so that they can, in the end, all really believe, like Justice Sachs first wrote in the sodomy judgment, that you have a right to be different and that difference should be celebrated. And that kind of thing is something that is a long way in the making, but the law plays a small part, along with Seven de Laan and whatever other soaps there are on TV. I don't really watch the soaps.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. The minute you mentioned a yellow van, I thought of my own experiences as a 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old. I'm not trying to give away my age here, but what little of apartheid I did experience, a lot of which involved a yellow van and a white man coming out of it. But what I did hear from you, which we will certainly engage a little later on, was one action, you kissing your darling Bongani, were two different experiences. In other words, you were a little more, if not decisively, more protected than Bongani in that act. White Afrikaans male, ultimately. I would have loved, if you like, the perspectives of a Bongani from that very same situation, how he might have felt, whether or not he might have had the courage to say exactly what you had said. I doubt his experience would have been different. Colleagues, for those of you who are joining, it is unfortunate that we have not yet been able to locate our dear friend and colleague on the platform, Zethu. So perhaps let me just quickly say this. Professor Zethu Matebeni is the country's first recipient of the South African Research Chairs Initiative in Sexualities, Genders, and Queer Studies. She's the second UFH academic to be awarded such a chairship by the National Research Foundation after Professor Gary Minkley, who holds that very same chair in social change, effectively known as Zethu. From the 1st of March this year, she was and has been since employed at the great University of Fort Hare. Everybody's nodding their heads because they agree with me. University of Fort Hare is a great university, produces quality people, including the chair of this very discussion. Let's play a video, please, because Justice Edwin Cameron referred to a particular timeline. There are highlights of the timeline that gets us to where we are. We spoke about the National Coalition, and I mean, it's a mouthful. That case of 1998, it's colloquially referred to as the sodomy judgment. We're going to talk about the things that led to that, and of course, the Fourie judgment after that. But let's play the video, please, Lee Davies.
Our struggle is first and foremost to decriminalize all sexual relations between consenting adults. Our other struggles relate to asking every single company, every government department, and every single person, our parents included, to recognize our relationships. And I think that is the fundamental right that every lesbian gay person in this country wants.
It was very difficult under apartheid to be an openly and proudly gay man or lesbian or transgendered or intersex person. There was oppression, there were police raids, there was persecution, there was stigma, there was violence. We used the law, just like we used the law for anti-apartheid work, in favor of LGBTI equality as well. We took cases, we opposed criminal prosecutions selectively and carefully. We used cases to advance knowledge of LGBTI equality.
The clause that we are fighting for to remain there is the clause that says no person shall be unfairly discriminated against on the grounds of race, gender, sex, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, or language.
The Constitutional Court has declared the Sexual Offences Act, which prohibits sexual conduct between men, unconstitutional. The judgment overturns the common law offence of sodomy, which made sex between men a criminal offence, irrespective of whether it was consensual or not.
The court has said that lesbians, gay men, and anybody who was affected by these laws have a right to equality and dignity and privacy, and that as a minority or as people who have been oppressed for a long time, that we have the right to assert our dignity, that we have the right to claim our citizenship.
It was remarkable for me that you had 11 constitutional court judges, black and white, male and female, old order, new order, who all signed on to a judgment that, for me as a gay man, expressed my dignity under the Constitution. It was a public pronouncement of my entitlement as a gay man to be a fully fledged member of the South African democracy.
No, I'm feeling good because like many things have changed. People are starting to accept us, and parents starting to understand what's going on.
South Africa is still the only country in the world who's got a clause in this constitution recognizing the rights of gays and lesbians. And in a sort of payment of respect to Madiba, we want to thank him for this fab constitution that he's given us.
Obviously, all our lives have been impacted. But, you know, if I think as a lawyer and a judge, our criminal law, our civil law, our law of evidence, our approach to the statutes, our first question as judges is always, is this fair? You know, we have to, every day, we have to look at the law to see, is it fair? Not, what is the rule? What a wonderful way to approach your work every day.
You know all about that, Justice Cameron, because you are a judge, a great one at that. And you always had to ask yourself that question. But presumably the way you were asking yourself that question came from a different place, say, and I'm not going to mention the name, but from another judge who didn't quite have your experience, who could have and would have, and in fact did always say for one's life, that other judge, I love so-and-so, because that so-and-so, if the person was a male, was a female, vice versa. Coming back to what Pierre said earlier on, it took 1994, and he had been long living before, to say, at least with the protection of the Constitution, that he could and did and would have wanted to kiss Bonganis and many Bonganis out there. But even then, it was qualified because the response was not as automatic as that which, if I said I love anybody now who's female, I would get. Now, that question of fairness, those experiences, the Simon Kolis of the world, Zaki Ahmas, and many of your contemporaries, how now, as a society, in closing, because you have to leave, do we move on? Because everything you say now will be engaged. How do we move on as a society? How do we take these lamentations of people, worthy human beings like any other, and make sure they are the mainstream? How do we ensure there are no disorders attached to them or any of those things that continuously assault, of all things, their dignity?
Songezo, thank you for that question. I'm heartbroken, Albie, that I'm not going to hear your input. I'm almost tempted to cancel our colleague, Judge Navi Pillay, who's about to give the annual human rights lecture at Stellenbosch, where I've committed myself. So, can I say that I was quite thrilled and a bit scared when I heard Jabulani and then Pierre, because I thought they were going to have a fight. Jabulani spoke about the emptiness of legal promises, and Pierce spoke about their liberating importance. But in the end, they said the same thing, which is that law is necessary but not sufficient. They both put it that way. We've got to go much, much further. Law is a necessary beginning. And of course, to get there, you've asked exactly the right question, Songeza. We need to consider from our history and from the rest of Africa the courage of people taking the stand. I think that queer visibility is absolutely indispensable. Jabulani, trans visibility. I mean, I confess about my own ignorance and stupidity on matters of trans within the movement. So the visibility of trans people, many of whom are listening, has been important in my own deepening understanding and humiliating me about my ignorance. Secondly, courage and solidarity and organizational activism on the part of queer people and their allies. So, Songeza, that's a long answer to your question, but I want to place us in our location as Africans. We face an African crisis of homophobia in Zambia, not far away, in Tanzania. Thank goodness we've now got a strict, observant Muslim woman as president rather than a curiously obsessional homophobe, President John Magufuli. Why? Why is President Edgar Lungu so preoccupied with queerness? Uganda, Nigeria, Cameroon, there are 2 people on trial right now in Cameroon for attempting homophobia. Trans people, as Jabulani has eloquently expressed. So to answer your question, I would say the sacrifice that Jabulani spoke about, the courage, and most important, the visibility to lead on to organizational solidarity and claiming our rights as we did, try to do, as Simon did, as Zaki did in our country. Thank you very much, Songezo.
Quickly, Judge, one minute. I mean, the African conversation cannot at all not discussed because it is important. We are ultimately an African country. 70 countries worldwide still criminalize homosexuality, same sex. All of the 70 countries still criminalize. You talk about African countries. On CNN, standing next to President Obama, Kenyatta has said that is not a Kenyan question. People of Kenya do not prioritize that. We are okay as a society with the laws that we have. A little more damning in his words, Yoweri Museveni from Uganda has said as much, to an extent that in these words, to hell with Museveni at the launch of your book, Justice. Dikgang Museneke said that at some point, remember?
He did.
How do we move as a people, as an African people, to recognize our diversity being a strength, to recognize the fact that far too many people still do not enjoy their bodies? How else then can they enjoy their communities, their resources, their environment at large? Quickly, please, Judge, I had to ask that.
I'm so glad that you recounted that current history, that all too current feelingful history, Songeza. I place queer people and their allies at the center of that. We have found in Kenya itself, there are multiple LGBTIQ organizations and queer-friendly organizations who are challenging that through the legal process. The new Chief Justice, let us hope that she presides over the case which is now moving through the courts into the Court of Appeal. It will end up before her in the Supreme Court, where we hope that there will be judges like Albie Sachs, Arthur Chaskelson, Dikgang Museneke, Pius Nkonzo-Langa, to decide that. So we have to claim our own entitlement to queerness, Songeza. That's the answer. You say, how do we make other people tolerant? Your fellow employees, your family, come out to your best friend, come out to your closest circle. You don't have to come out in the Sunday newspapers or on a platform, but claim your identity. That is the start of insight and consciousness, and it leads to an acceptance in a greater political, structured, organizational sense as well.
Judge, thank you so much for the indulgence. I do appreciate that, as I do the fact that you have to leave. So go on then, be well, be merry, and we will see each other on the other side of this webinar. Justice Cameron is out, or rather in the context of this conversation, Edwin is out, and I see that Zetu is back. If she is very quick to avail her face, we will go straight through to her. But I had made allowance for a judge, another judge, to come onto the platform and offer his experiences, particularly in framing a legal environment that, in the words of Pierre, becomes therefore a culture, assisting through law, establishing a culture that is receptive to diversity, that allows people to claim their respective identities. Good evening, LB. Welcome to the platform. Your thoughts, please. Zetu, I recognize you. We will be back with you just shortly, but Albie, your experiences sitting from the apex court.
Okay, the first point to make is it was an enormous help to have a text, words in the Constitution about sexual orientation. We didn't have to invent it and bring it in as a matter of general human rights. It was there. And I'd like to support Edwin in the praise that he heaped on Simon Cordy. He was absolutely central because he linked up the freedom struggle against apartheid, against racial oppression, with the right to be different, the right to be who you are. The right to be who you are is central to any kind of constitutional order. And we knew it. We knew it in the struggle. He influenced influential people, absolutely vital. But there are two other, and Sheila Lipinski also played a very big role in Olga. She cornered me as soon as I came back from exile. And they asked me from Olga, Comrade Albie, what would you say our strategy should be in using the law? And I said, my suggestion is don't start with gay marriage, same-sex marriage, end with that. Start with decriminalization. That's the most vicious public form of, brutal form of oppression. And you'll get wide public support for that. Move then to equality, non-discrimination in work and in general rights, and end up with same-sex marriages. And that was the sequence that was pursued. But I'd like to add two other totally unexpected heroes to the pantheon of people who contributed to getting the word sexual orientation into the Constitution. And the one is Thabo Mbeki, and the other is Lawrence du Plessis. And I only discovered their roles preparing the timeline that was used as the basis for this particular roundtable. In the case of Thabo Mbeki, I call him Thabo, it was a conference at Victoria Falls of writers from South Africa meeting ANC writers. And many of the writers from South Africa, 1989, we're still in exile, straight away fired off. What's the ANC's position on sexual orientation? Because there'd been some statements made in London that were really quite unacceptable on that. And Thabo just grandly said very firmly, ANC's position is consensual sex between adults should not be a source of discrimination and penalization. And I remember Palo Jordan saying to me afterwards, where did Palo get that from? We've never discussed it on the NEC. With Oliver Tambo, there's no doubt he would support that. He's a natural Democrat. But there are other members of the NEC who might take a different position. And lo and behold, not long afterwards, at the Conference of ANC Women, which was organized by Zanele Mbeki, the issue of non-discrimination on sexual orientation was accepted as a principle at a decision-making conference. So now the ANC and the ANC Constitutional Committee had a foundation for doing that. So Thabo, who afterwards was highly criticized for his positions on HIV/AIDS, at least in this respect, played a very positive role. Then later on, getting the words into the Constitution, into the interim Constitution, where it was Lawrence du Plessis and Hugh Corder chairing that particular committee. And the instruction was, don't put anything controversial in. So social and economic rights are not in. And it was Edwin who sent Kevin Botha to that group to put in sexual orientation. And immediately Kobu Kutsi said, no, 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 no. Does that mean bestiality will be approved? And Lawrence du Plessis, it was Hugh Corder who told me this the other day, looking like a rugby player, leaned forward and he said, Minister, I think he was still minister then, and he just gave him hell. He put him down. So it was this like Boer Calvinist Afrikaner professor, then at Stellenbosch University, who crushed, and it got into the Constitution then. So very surprising support. But the support was based on deep principle from people in the hetero world who felt it's our dignity that's assailed. When our fellow human beings are being assailed for being who they are being not allowed to live as full human beings, it's our dignity that's also being affected. And the country we were fighting for, the free South Africa, was a South Africa where people could be who they were. Now let me move to Judge L.B. Sachs. The first case, the sodomy case, we were unanimous on that, and a beautiful judgment from Lawrence, from Laurie Ackerman. And I cottoned onto that and introduced things like critical race feminism and intersectionality, which weren't binding on the whole court, but became very important later on. Because in the Home Affairs case afterwards, what the state was saying is gays and lesbians can marry, but they can't marry members of the same gender, but they're not forbidden the right to marry. And Lawrence picked up on intersectionality to say they can marry, but they can't marry the partner of their choice. And that is the source of the discrimination. It's the combination of the right to marry and your sexual orientation not being discriminated against. Kathy Satchwell played a very important role getting the right for her partner now as a judge to be treated with the same rights as my wife, Vanessa September, in terms of rights to pension and so on. There were other cases dealing with fertility, with adoption. Another judge, I think Peter would know, that his sister was involved, the rights of parenting and the right of the non-judge, the non-significant figure, but to spend more time with the two twins they had adopted, to have equal rights as the mother. And all of that paved the way for the same-sex marriage case, for Reed. And we kept saying, we're not dealing with same-sex marriage. We kept putting it off. Finally, it came to same-sex marriage. The main argument there, given the text of our Constitution, was same-sex couples can regulate their affairs according to law. Families, tenancy, inheritance, but don't call it marriage. The M word became the center of the whole thing. And our response is, that's the whole point. Why do you say don't call it marriage? If marriage is so meaningful, everybody should have the right to choose and not be compelled. And so we unanimously agreed that same-sex couples have the right to marry. My colleague Kate O'Regan said should be from midnight tonight, tomorrow morning. I said no with the majority. Send it to Parliament. Parliament has the same responsibility to recognize the rights of same-sex couples as the court has. We don't want a funny kind of court-ordered marriage. Parliament was shouldered that responsibility, and Parliament eventually a year later did. And I might say, now speaking as Albie, Comrade Albie, who became Judge Albie, for me, it's been one of the most deep and profound things in my whole life that I've been party to this process of liberation. If liberation means something, it's got to be liberation for everybody. And it's been enormously meaningful to me. And to me, it has been a victory. We celebrate our victories. A victory doesn't mean the end of the struggle. You build on the victories. You honor the people who fought for those things. You fight for the next victory and the next victory after that.
I muted myself there for a moment, to beg your pardon. Perhaps that's a metaphor, because I saw a lot of Jabu just going like this. Hell yeah, hell yeah. Jabu, I mean, just this last point Judge Sachs refers to, the fact that there was a temptation from Cato Regan to say, tonight, make it law. But the foresight from the majority of the bench was, let this be the people decide, as opposed to that judges decide. And critical in that, you lose now to gain later on. Make it Parliament who brings the change, because it is Parliament who is there for and on behalf of the people. That was the law. Iranti, of course, is a movement, an advocacy organization, human rights-based organization. That's really now the work of the Irantis of the world, to ensure that these judgments are not just texts that sit pretty in the ivory towers of the Constitutional Court, cited by academics, applauded by the world for what they are, judgments, but rather, more importantly, translating into lived experiences so that Jabu does not have to look over his shoulder, wondering where the next assault comes from. So how then do we from law evolve into a culture, which culture then wins people over, and therefore there is no need for an individual to claim one's identity, because society, the environment, and everything else reflects the multiplicity of identities.
Okay, I've spoken at some length now.
That was for Jabu. Sorry. So sorry,
Yeah.
Albie. I'm asking to Jabu. I'm asking Jabu.
Well, thank you so much, and a real great honor to share the space with Judge Albie Sachs. I remember really reading that judgment. There was one line that stood out about the fact that religion has no place and grounding in determining, the basis around the Constitution, that morality is a space in another domain, and this domain in which we are is a human rights domain. And I, as a young 20-something-year-old then, really valued understanding and learning the very basis of what our struggles entail now. And I think those struggles still exist. And I think the question is twofold, because the one is, when we became a democracy, I remember going across the country with so many other organizations, teaching communities about how to vote, what does the democracy mean, what is the Constitution. And I think there's a huge regression in constitutional literacy across the country, that in fact, not only within relation to LGBTI rights, but generally the majority of people in this country are persistently face abuse, because one, constitutional literacy and knowing our rights is just absent, and knowing where to go. And I think sadly we've also seen a massive decline. When I was younger, there was a massive movement of the black sash and paralegal officers, where you could just walk in and you could see somebody regarding your violation. And now, with a shrinking civil society, that has also become challenging. And then equally, I think with a state that is quite dysfunctional in understanding how to fully apply the law and apply the Constitution. So I think we're really sitting in that kind of problem right now. And given that we are really struggling with socioeconomic inequalities, poverty, the excessiveness that brings in relation to violence and the inherent violence of this country, it makes the issue about rights almost feel privileged or elite, versus that they actually should be embodied and embedded in our daily practice, in our daily work, our daily lives. So I think this is a massive challenge. One of the issues right now with government is really trying to get them to fully understand how to implement that Section 9 and the sexual orientation, gender identity legislation. And there's so much training and education going on with government, and the president now occasionally says the right thing. But remember, even before this president, we have a previous president for nearly a decade that was highly problematic. And under his rule, we had seen almost a behavior of patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia just happen with absolute impunity. So there's a lot of undoing and a lot of rethinking around where do we go as a country. And I'm sure there's the law, but beyond the law, there's so much more that really needs to be put in place. And that's our job, is to keep going and to keep assisting the state, both in terms of rectifying them in law, but also rectifying them in terms of mindset and attitude. That's our role. You're on mute.
Pia, sorry about that. From what Jabu is saying, it's clearly not an occasion or a question of once liberated, always liberated. It fluctuates. And with evolution come new challenges. Evolutions come through and need to have almost the same kind of momentum, and which momentum should build on from one phase of the struggle to the next. And of course, from that experience, then it is clear in the context of the question, queer equality, has the Constitution fulfilled its promise of dignity for all? At a different era, different time, the question could have been answered as yes from your experience at the time with Bongani. But of course now from what Jabu has said, these are examples that all of us are alive to. These are experiences that we can all relate to, because all we need to do is turn the television set on, and every now and then we are prompted to know that perhaps the constitutional literacy is not embedded in the people. The evolutions of culture every now and then again assaults people. So therefore, from a sociological perspective, the inequalities persist. I'm talking sociological because this is really the domain of Zethu, but nonetheless, you are in academia, you are in an environment that is especially dealing with young people who've got as much a right as anybody, but more importantly, they come from slightly an era where they are less patient with the status quo. They demand their rights a little bit more perhaps than the generation before them.
Yes, and I think it's a good thing. Our students, some of our students are quite impatient, especially I think because of what I said in the beginning, that there was a time when some of us at least, almost were believing too much that the Constitution and just adopting laws are going to actually profoundly and immediately change things. And that is not how systemic oppression works. And so while, as I agree with everybody else, we've all said it, that it is so important that we have the Constitution, that the laws have been changed. But now the question is, what do we do now? And it's a challenge because I think one of the things that everybody has also said, but how to do it is very difficult, is how do you build solidarity between people who are oppressed in many different ways, and it lands differently for different people who are differently situated. Because for me, I think the problem with the Constitution is not that it hasn't given everything that it promised, because in retrospect, that was not going to happen. It's not possible for the law to do that. The problem is perhaps that there's a tendency in a constitutional state, to revert to what the academics call lawfare, where the struggle, you think, is only going to happen in the court of law. And that is very important to have that struggle, but you shouldn't then stop doing the other work. And the other work is really about working with other people, trying to make links with other people who are also oppressed, maybe not in exactly the same way that you are. But that's very difficult in South Africa because we're profoundly divided. If you're a white gay man living in an upper middle class area, you have to have some kind of, it's less likely, let's be nice and say it's less likely that you are going to understand that there is a kind of connection in some ways. There's a shared kind of commitment that we should have towards addressing racism, addressing inequality, addressing sexism, again, addressing transphobia, making education better. and the like. So just to conclude, whenever I get depressed, I watch the movie Pride, which is a fantasy based on a real story in the UK at the time of Margaret Thatcher. He was trying to break the unions, and there was a small group of gay boys and 2 lesbians, and they said, oh, the miners are oppressed, we are oppressed, we're going to get in a bus and we're going to help them. Of course, they arrived at the miners' compound, and the miners were appalled because the miners were all homophobic. But the whole movie is about how that interaction educated both groups. And in the end, it was the miners who got the Labour Party to change their attitude towards sexual orientation. So it's that kind of politics, which in South Africa is profoundly difficult to do, that I think is what is maybe lacking, and whether it is because we think everything, or for a while maybe we thought that everything can be achieved through the courts, I don't know.
Judge Sachs, Albie, you're an activist before anything else. And from just what Jabu and Pierre have said, as important as lawfare is, pronouncements coming from the courts, updating of the law to be contemporary with the issues of the times in which people are engaging the law. Most important, I get the sense, is social activism. The more social activism there is, the less there is a requirement for the lawfare. Put differently, the more lawfare there is, it means the more socially there are these tensions. How then do we galvanize as a society? I know I'm speaking to you in most respects as a previous generation to the generation that now the baton falls to whom for the purposes of really the energy where it is required mostly. But certainly the institutional memory of social activism doesn't change. And in your case, it isn't lost, fortunately. Social activism, how do we get there? Lessons learned from the past, the Ngolis, the Ahmads, the Camerons, to get to where we are now and to get to where we have to go as a society for our collective development's sake.
You know, Songezo, for me, the paradigm case that connects the social activism with the legal thinking is the treatment action campaign case. And it's a beautiful example of the people living with HIV in the communities on the ground, organize themselves, treatment action campaign. We want the right to antiretrovirals. They got together with good communicators, journalists and others. So the story was told. And the lawyers produced a case very carefully, meticulously documented. It wasn't one against the other. It wasn't one against the other. And the decision of the court transformed the whole approach of government to antiretrovirals. We now have the biggest anti-ARV program in the world. So I hold that up as an example. If you like, it connects my activism as a revolutionary in exile, blown up, almost losing my life, with my life wearing the gown as a judge, sitting in the treatment action campaign. I didn't write the decision, I was a party to it. And I think it applies today to all the areas that have been raised. You need the people, as Edwin said, most directly affected to speak out proudly in their own voice to the people closest to them generally. You need combined action. You need allies. You need to get people on the ground from different backgrounds all working together for what Kathy Satchell said, basic fairness. But you also need well-prepared litigation. And in that sense, the role of the court, it's not just like a backstop. It's defining public morality. It's so much under pressure now, and we need the court. It's fundamental that that constitution, the things we were fighting for, democracy, fairness, openness, responsibility, accountability, all of those things are absolutely vital. So I'm a little bit skeptical of this word lawfare. It's mainly used by conservative people who don't want to see the courts being used to defend fundamental rights. And they're suggesting the judges are overreaching themselves. It's the judges doing the job that the Constitution gives them to do, upholding the fundamental dignity of everybody and the principles of openness, of accountability, of responsiveness that are enshrined in our Constitution. And if the other organs of government fail, the courts have that role as the ultimate guardian. But the courts on their own can't do it. They can't speak in the name of the people. They can't do the mobilization. But the mobilization of the people, well-prepared cases, can produce wonderful results. And the TAC case, I think, is an example of that and can be applied in future forms of strategy.
Persons most affected need to lead this social activism. Here's a question from the floor. I'm directing this one to you, Jabulani, because you are, of the three anyway, the one I am picking on, or I think can better respond, so to speak. Melinda asks, I am a mom of a transgender child, and along with many such families have been trying to get the Department of Basic Education to include our kids in schools, to give effect to our kids' rights to education, to dignity, to equality, among many others. I've asked the department for help with this as long ago as 2018. Of course, I have since learned that parents and advocates have been trying to get this in place for years before my request. No policy, no guidelines to schools. Do we really have to institute a constitutional case so that our kids can be treated like kids, like people, not be brutalized, traumatized, outed, othered, belittled, excluded? Jabu?
Yeah, I would love also just a legal perspective on that, because I think well done to Melinda and parents like Melinda who continue to never be silent around the protection of their children at schools, in school environments. We've seen an escalation of bullying, and I think when you add transgender children and non-binary children to those elements, you would fear for the safety of your child in any school environment in South Africa. You know, given the high levels of just violence and suicidality. And I think there's a number of things that we never fully explore around the rights of the child, because it does feel like the state gives that power over to parents and to institutions and not to the child itself. And so from the place of birth, a child's right is already taken away. Even at birth, that child has no rights, because in the case of intersex born children, medical doctors would say that the consent for unnecessary medical surgeries on intersex born children has been given to the parent. And therefore, the parent is forced to make a decision on whether this child should be a binary child of a girl or a boy. And these surgeries, we know, are unnecessary. There are no medical emergencies to being born intersex. You are just born intersex. And similar to children who identify as non-binary or as transgender. So the violence that children face from the point of birth, when they are non-normative, when they are is a massive issue that we haven't fully explored, and only when a child reaches a particular age of close to adolescent or being an adult does that child have the right to their human rights. And I would love to get a perspective on this, because I think we don't speak about the violence from birth, out of the womb, into violence, into a system that forces you into a cis binary identity of being a girl or a boy. And this violence permeates from our houses to our churches to our schools. And really, ultimately, where do children lie and rest in this way? Where are their rights and protections at?
I've avoided any conversation around the church, because then we will be here all day. But Pierre, what is the legal answer to that very same question Melinda asks? Because there's a social response, if you like, that has come through from Jabu. But legally speaking now, I mean, this is something which persists now. That child is being told to have dinner now to go to bed in an hour because they have to go to school tomorrow. And for so long as that child is going to school with this experience, it does require, if you like, lawfare.
Yes, so this with this I will agree with Albie. Sometimes, well, these things wouldn't happen if they were not brave children and if they were not brave parents who are now pushing back. So that's the first step. So 10 years ago, one didn't see this. Now, in the last year, I've had several emails from school principals asking me for advice about what to do, which is a good sign because it means that people are pushing back against it. I think that what is really needed is a judgment from the Constitutional Court that says that Section 9.3 prohibits any kind of unfair discrimination, not only those listed, also other grounds which the court can discover, so to speak, one of them being gender identity or whatever the term is that people choose, so that it becomes something that you can also use as a kind of threat to the school principals, to the authorities and the like. And I think, but even without that, I think the existing Equality Act, you can interpret it to say that every school has an obligation not to discriminate. That includes the obligation reasonably to accommodate everybody. And so the school has to accommodate those children. The details of that is tricky. I don't know enough about it, but I would be confident to make an argument that the school has an obligation to accommodate.
Yeah, I can't get my discipline right here. Thanks, Pia. Thanks, Jabu. We have now entered the realm of concluding remarks, and I'm going to prompt you a bit here, Judge Albie, with the hope that you will indulge me, because ultimately I was quite thrown by the fact that a judgment almost has to be used as a threat to give effect to 1, 9, and 10. 1 is, the Republic of South Africa is one sovereign, democratic state founded on the following values: human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. That's 1. 9 is, everyone is equal before the law and has the right to equal protection and benefit of the law. If all else fails, we go to 10. Everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected. It's an unqualified right. It's the second shortest of all injunctions in the Constitution behind life. Everyone has a right to life. And I might as well use everyone has the right to life, because we know people of the queer community are looking over their shoulders, looking for a dagger that may potentially come to mow them down. They're being killed. Judge?
I think what the discussion today has illuminated is a huge victory was won in terms of the massive historical discrimination against gays and lesbians at that time. And even the Unity Equality Group was gay and lesbian equality. And that was important for humanity, for South Africa. What's become clear is those categories are too broad. There are people who are different in terms of their sexuality, the sexual orientation, and even biologically and spiritually and personally. And it's people like Jabulani who are putting the issue on the agenda and speaking beautifully with so much thought. It's raised the issues to a new kind of a level. You've read with your best law clerk voice, with resonance, themes in the Constitution that struck me immediately now as being very, very protective of the right of people to be who they are, intersex people and trans people. And it's profoundly on the agenda now. And the claim is being made now. You don't have people having to be fitted into classifications. The classifications in the law must fit people as they are with their dignity. So it would seem to me that the time is very ripe now for extensive advancing, campaigning, building of alliances, consciousness raising, but starting with the people most directly affected by people like Belinda, who's fighting so bravely, as Pierre has said. So if I can feel proud that we're having this round table, it's because it's now not sitting back and saying, well done, everybody, we've made great achievements, long live the progressive-minded people of South Africa. It's not on a basis of complacency at all. It's to say, yes, we pat ourselves on the back for what we've achieved, we build on those achievements, and here are the issues now, they're cutting-edge issues, and they're not just for the individuals concerned, they're for our imaginations, our consciousness, the kind of people we are. How open are we to the variability of humankind, which as Edwin said, is foundational to South Africa going forward. We've just got to not only accept and tolerate, but take pride in the fact that we are so different and enjoy, be united in our diversity. And that would be my last word on this particular topic, except also to thank you for not being a moderator who simply sits back and allows people to talk, but engaging with us and provoking us, including myself.
And I hope I have not been offensive in the context of my provoking. Let me come to you, Pierre, before Jabu has the final word. Pierre, we are in the realm of continuously educating people through law, but our experiences, more importantly, allowing other people into our spaces and us being in other people's spaces. And in a world where it says we must socially distance, probably not assisting the continued struggle and social mobilization for people to claim their identities. And of course, Jabu referred to the socioeconomic inequalities that are here in this country specifically that have not allowed this conversation to have the kind of traction that it would otherwise have if our society was a little more equal. So how do all of these inequalities, be it political inequality, social inequality, economic inequality, finally, if they can be addressed, will make the task that much easier, would form this culture to be so much more vibrant, receptive, and allow the diversity that we'll pride ourselves on as a society. But for so long as you have the experiences that you have, it becomes a very different conversation.
Yes, so obviously, I mean, it's the sickness in a way that is at the heart of the South African society, is inequality that is material inequality, but also inequality of status because of homophobia, racism, sexism, and the like. And it's difficult. These are all, they are moving parts. They're all linked up to one another. And if it is correct that as Edwin said, and I think it is, that actually connecting with other people is a powerful personal way of doing a kind of politics, of coming out, of connecting with people. One of the problems we have in South Africa, but maybe I'm saying that because I'm sitting in Cape Town, one of the things we have here, as many other cities, is the city is economically, racially, completely and spatially segregated because it's apartheid segregation. So even if inequality is somehow reduced, the spatial segregation remains. So there are so many different things. So in a way, I'm saying if you are for queer rights, you must be for spatial justice. If you are fighting against racial discrimination, you must be against queer rights, because these things are all linked. And the struggle is going to continue for many, many years because these things are not going to be addressed or resolved today or in the next whenever.
too many times. I beg your pardon again, comrades. Jabu, we believe that the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, and queer landscape on the African continent is fast changing and requires an organization that can adapt to the changing circumstances just as fast. We believe that violence against lesbians, gender non-conforming, trans, and intersex persons in Africa has increased over the years and demands rapid response and in real time. To optimize our impact, we are committed to being agile and responsive to these fast changing circumstances while still keeping to our mission and strategic outcomes. What this ultimately says to me as I read it, social partnerships are fundamental in this continued struggle, precisely because it is agile, it changes from era to era, but the core of it all remains, and it doesn't seem like, if the arguments addressed here is that we are getting quite near to the core. Strides have been made, but that core remains elusive, precisely because the goalposts change, because of the evolutionary nature of the queer question.
Wow, I think there's so many things that we just and I think Judge Albie Sachs has said that. I wrote down the sentence that says classifications must fit people. I want a t-shirt that says that, because I think it's so much about self-determination and where we are. And I think, you know, as a continent and as a country, we are really still undoing so many things that colonialism brought to us, that apartheid brought to us. You know, we undoing consistently. And I think the one thing that we have to strengthen as a society is to really think about mutual aid and mutual cooperation. That it's not just my loaf of bread, it's about sharing. It's about how do we reach out to each other in different ways. How do we celebrate pride across various communities in our society? And so I think my voice here is really a representation of the multitude of work that is done from a voluntary level within the LGBTI community to a paid salaried level like mine within the LGBTI community, that across our communities, we know that where the state hasn't provided that service, we have to step up. And I think the resilience, we don't celebrate that too much, because in our traumatized bodies, we are focused so much on trauma and pain, but there is so much resilience. There is so much that about not giving up, about change, about really working and ensuring that the constitution we have becomes that reality, that we can live in dignity and in freedom with mutual respect. You know, and I think that is very fundamental. And so I do want to salute everybody that is just doing what they can to support and extend support even to families right now that are mourning children that have been lost due to violence. And I think we have to honor the people that are doing the work that is not fully celebrated or recognized in our society. And those are the people on the ground. And I salute them tonight for what they bring to us in kind of creating safety and awareness. And thank you for the amazing panel.
Absolutely, the panel has been great. But I must say, it is a pity we didn't have the perspectives of Zethu, and that's because of another pandemic, if you like, another question that requires constitutional engagement. Goodness gracious, when can Eskom get its act together? Because she has load shedding where she is. It didn't help, of course, the fact that it happened during a storm. So we do appreciate the willingness of Zethu to come on board. We are incredibly sorry to those who were looking forward to her perspectives, just as we all were, as the Nelson Mandela Foundation, together with Cornell Trust and my esteemed fellow panelists, former Constitutional Court Judge Albie Sachs, professor at University of Cape Town, the founding member of Iranti in Jabu. Prof. Zethu is a sociologist and writer whose work focuses on African queer studies. In 2017, she was the presidential visiting professor at the Women's Gender and Sexualities Studies Department at Yale University in the United States. A year later, she was awarded the African Humanities Program Fellowship, as well as the African Studies Association, American Council of Learned Societies Presidential Fellowship. So she and her perspectives are thoroughly missed from this conversation. And I cannot express enough how sorry we are, only because of bloody electricity, of all things that would have prevented her to come on. That all said, this is not the last opportunity there will be for her thoughts to be engaged, and the work continues. The 25-year celebrations, of course, do indeed continue. For those who are interested, the balance of the material that would have been flighted as a teaser, particularly the video and that timeline, it is on the Conhill website, so please make sure to visit that website and add your voice there, especially to the timeline. Do consider following on social media platforms the work of Conhill, as well as the Nelson Mandela Foundation, as well as particularly these roundtables. This is the second installment, hopefully of 5. The third one, happening in July, will focus on electoral systems and related reform. What a time to have that in the context of what may or may not happen later on this year, that being the local government elections. Thank you, Jabu. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Albi. Thank you, Nero. Thank you, Luando. In absentia, thank you to Zetu, as well as Edwin. And most importantly, because we wouldn't do this if it was just ourselves, thanks to you at home who made this thing not just possible, but important and appropriate. And thank you so much for the engagements. There were many, we couldn't get through to them, simply because time is always the enemy. That said, for many of you, it's time for dinner, just as it is for me time to go home. Don't want to get caught in the curfew, and I don't even know what time the curfew is. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much for your time.